So, what a turbulent week it's been. 2 weeks, really. It just went from being the death of a black man at the hands of a white officer and others in Minneapolis to being a debate about pulling down statues in the United Kingdom and elsewhere. Um, so, yesterday at the West India Quay, the statue of Robert Milligan, who was a plantation owner, a slaver, operating in Jamaica. He had about 500 slaves in Jamaica, was taken down from the West India Quay in East London. This is a picture actually from the Times. No copyright infringement intended, full property of the Times. Now, unlike the statue of Edward Colston in Bristol, this was taken down officially by presumably the council. I guess that would be, I imagine, Newham or Tower Hamlets. But it was taken down officially. There was a small crowd watching, Black Lives Matter people cheering. But it was a bit more ordered than the scenes of Edward Colston, which made world news. Um, in Oxford, the movement has its sights on Cecil Rhodes. That's not entirely a new thing. The Rhodes Must Fall campaign has been going on since at least 2015. Cecil Rhodes was a famous British imperialist, famously put into a political cartoon, The Rhodes Colossus. I think it was by Puck. It showed a giant Cecil Rhodes with 1 foot in Cairo and 1 foot in Cape Town, showing that the railways would connect the British Empire and Africa. Rhodes was one of the most famous imperialists of his day, and a controversial figure. But he lends his name, or lent his name, I should say, to the Rhodes Scholarship, which enables many students to come on to further education in the UK from around the world. Um, there's been talk of having Gandhi statue removed because, venerated as he is, Gandhi today is seen in some quarters as an outright racist because he did hold some fairly controversial views. I know a statue of Gandhi was removed in Accra, Ghana, a few years ago. Actually, I think it was just last year. Um, so this is my take on the issue of statues. Incidentally, here in Sunderland, and I hope I'm not inciting anything here, because I'm not comfortable with the removal of statues, and I'll explain why in a minute. But in Sunderland, we have a statue to Henry Havelock. He was a general during the Indian Mutiny of 1857. So could he be a target as a representative of British imperialism? Who knows? It's a big statue overlooking Building Hill, overlooking, back Mowbray Park in Sunderland city centre. Um, the Churchill statue, of course, got vandalised, was a racist. Well, Churchill had racist views, there's no question about it. But I would make the point Churchill was a product of his generation. He may have been prime minister in the 40s, but he was very much of a Victorian mindset, and those sort of attitudes were prevalent at the time. That's not to excuse them, but I think the problem here is that it really, really looks like a sort of attempt to purify society. And more than a few people have compared this to the Cultural Revolution in China in the 60s. I actually saw that initially, a comparison on the Milk Tea Alliance, which is a group of young people from across Asian countries standing up to tyranny, particularly Chinese tyranny, um, exhibited by the Chinese Communist Party. But they actually made this comparison. They said that looking at what's happening in the West with the statue removals, it kind of looks like the Cultural Revolution. The young Red Guards in the Cultural Revolution believed they were cleansing China of the old feudalistic system and the slave mentality. They were convinced they were doing the right thing. Now, that's not to say that men like Edward Colston and Robert Milligan, don't have a negative side. I don't think there's any debate about their role in the slave trade. I personally think that the best approach in these situations would probably be, if a statue is to stay, and have a plaque detailing the negative side of their life as well. So saying, for example, this person was a philanthropist, was a merchant, they also engaged in the slave trade, right? So it's not censoring it. I do believe that countries need to be honest about their past. I don't think we should censor our past, and I don't think we should whitewash the negative history of prominent figures. So I've no problem with Edward Colston or Robert Milligan being, the fact that these were men who profited from an evil trade, that needs to be known. Um, but the scenes in Bristol were just chaotic, and it looked like sheer anarchy. And whatever way you look at it, it is vandalism. I mean, there's some material damage. Leave aside the politics for a second. It's actually just vandalism. I mean, they're throwing it into the river. Yeah, I was thinking, Extinction Rebellion will have a bit of a dilemma to protest the pollution that it's going to cause in the River Avon, and ostensibly be a barrier to vessels going down there, or you know, be woke and align themselves with the toppling of this racist. Um, I think a compromise would have been to send a statue to maybe open a new museum in Bristol dedicated to telling the history of the slave trade and put a statue of him there. That way, there's not vandalism going on, but he's not being whitewashed. His record is being exposed. So I've no problem with the controversial side of historic figures being shown. With Churchill, for example, Churchill did have less reputable side. His disastrous involvement in the Dardanelles campaign in the First World War, his unquestionably racialist views. Churchill had a negative side, but that doesn't change the fact his leadership saved this country in its darkest hour. So I was disgusted when I saw one protester burning the Union Jack at the Cenotaph the day after the 6th of June. The 6th of June, of course, being the anniversary of D-Day. Um, it's different if someone buys a flag on eBay and burns it themselves because it's their property, but that is clearly inflammatory. And people who say it's just a piece of cloth, I think they're being very, very short-sighted. It's not just a piece of cloth, it's symbolic, and that was clearly a provocative act. And I think it's disgraceful that person wasn't arrested for criminal damage, um, and potentially even incitement. I mean, it's expressing hatred against this country. And the whole thing about flag burning and flag desecration gets into a murky area about free speech. I I'm not saying that people should necessarily be punished for burning the flag, but I don't think it's harmless either. And I think if you're burning a flag at a cenotaph, specifically made to honor war dead, I think that should be seen as akin to a hate crime because it is stirring up hatred against the symbol of the country for which those men and women died for. It's a completely inflammatory act. Um, but my concern about toppling of statues is this. By the way, Keir Starmer said that he didn't approve of the way it was done, but the statue should have been removed a long time ago. My understanding is in Bristol there has long been a petition to do this. But there is another argument. Why is it the mob gets to determine, who stays and who goes? Because there isn't a consensus on this. Wherever you think of figures like Edward Colston and Robert Milligan, there isn't actually a consensus that those statues should go. So why should um, what is it, 150,000 protesters out of a population of 67 million get to dictate these things? Um, my concern about it is it seems like a cultural revolution. It seems like an attempt to purify our society. Where do you draw the line? Where do you draw the line? I mean, under this logic, pretty much the whole city of Bristol was built on the slave trade. It became one of the most prosperous cities of the empire thanks to the slave trade. I believe it was the third city of the United Kingdom in the 18th century or second. So should we knock down the whole city of Bristol? Um, should the hymn Amazing Grace, that's used around the world, should it suddenly be outlawed? Does it happen to be written by a slaver who later, changed his ways and I was blind and now I can see? If you try to purify history, you're going to be constantly disappointed because you will find most of the great heroic figures in history. had a slightly less noble side. All of them. All of them. So do we just now honor no one? Do we just, completely have a cultural revolution and tear everything down? The statues of Cromwell and Richard the Lionheart are being now put into speculation. Should they be targeted? Well, Cromwell's forces caused massacres in Ireland. He's understandably a controversial figure in Ireland. And within England, he was basically a dictator. Yet he was one of the most single important figures in our history. You know, Richard the Lionheart um, ordered an anti-Jewish pogrom during his coronation, or at least an anti-Jewish pogrom occurred during his coronation. He barely spent any time in England. He was not actually a great monarch, despite his veneration. Um, I've no problem whatsoever with historic figures being debated. I don't think any historic figure is above criticism. And I've, spoken out against what I see as idolatry of anyone. So I guess you could argue that's what statues are. They idolize people. Um, I don't see why there can't be a compromise where you keep the statue there, but you just replace it with a new plaque saying this person was known for this, this, and this, and he also done this. But it does seem like this is basically an assault on a large part of Western civilization. Yes, they might say it's a negative part of Western civilization, but where do they draw the line? Black Lives Matter has apparently written up a list of 60 statues that they have in their sites. So are they just going to engage in mob rule and tear these statues down? It's criminal damage, whatever way you look at it. That's what it is. Um, I do think council should listen. I think if a statue is controversial, I do think council should listen to that. For example, either relocate them to a museum or put a plaque on them. Um, in the United States, the debate, of course, has long been over Confederate memorials. Well, I can sort of understand Confederate generals, but what about the ordinary Confederate troops? The vast majority of them didn't own slaves. They were poor farm boys. And, they died in their tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands. The casualties were less than the Union forces, but, this was a devastating civil war. So it seems to me if memorials to Confederates are being vandalized or taken down, is that really a sweep at slavery? I'm not so sure that it is. I mean, Robert E. Lee, for example, had a pretty ambiguous stance on slavery. It was said that he personally disapproved of it, but he fought for the Confederacy. Of course, he was even in the start of the war asked to command the Union Army. I just don't like where this may be going because I think it's going down a line of trying to purify history. And it's okay to look at history and say, okay, let's not whitewash it, let's not sanitize it, let's look at the negative sides. I'm okay with that. But what's happening right now is something else. It's basically mob rule. And, we may see a very troubled summer. This has been a long year with COVID, and it's, to think we're only in June. If people come out, if there's already warnings of lockdown riots because the poor are impacted more, tensions might build. If Black Lives Matter keep their protests, ironically, that's going to spread the virus, which will put more risk to Black and Asian medical staff because then it puts more pressure on the NHS. But apparently some football hooligan groups have threatened to, confront Black Lives Matter. I assume from white nationalist factions. There was one incident, I believe it was in Hoddesdon, Hertfordshire, where some local white people were kind of shouting back at Black Lives Matter. One of them shouted out, "Go back to Africa," which of course is not helpful. But um, I'm a little concerned where all of this is going because where do they draw the line? Because if you look at the history of most institutions or most historic figures, you're going to find some negative side. Um, I mean, racial attitudes were rife in the Victorian era. Even abolitionists, many of them actually believed in white supremacy. They believed slavery was evil, and they believed it was their Christian duty to end slavery, but they still believed that white civilization was superior. Um, I mean, this is where history gets murky, and I think that we, if we're going to go down a line of just trying to purify history, these campaigners, they're never ever going to be content because they'll keep scratching at the surface and saying, "Well, that's imperfect. That was connected to slavery. That was connected to racism. That was connected to the British Empire. Let's just tear it down." So I um, I think that the way it should be done is if there is enough of a public discontent with a statue honoring someone that a large consensus of the public, not a minority, but a consensus of the public feels shouldn't be there, then it should be taken down by the council formally, not torn down, but just dismantled and maybe put to a museum. Um, and if it's a case that the majority want the statue to stay, I think it's reasonable to put a plaque saying, okay, but this person was involved in the slave trade, let's not gloss that over. The irony with the Edward Colston statue is I understand that had actually went ahead. So it's not like Bristol was totally whitewashing his record. Maybe they were when the statue went up in 1895. But in more recent years, I think there has been a more honest assessment of Colston. In other words, was it really necessary to bring the statue down if there was already a plaque talking about his role in the slave trade? I mean, I saw someone make this ridiculous analogy with when Saddam Hussein fell in Baghdad. And they're saying, oh, these Western hypocrites who are criticizing the toppling of statues here were okay when Saddam toppled. It's a totally different situation because we're talking about historic figures in the case of Colston, who died 299 years ago. Saddam Hussein was a brutal dictator who had literally just been toppled. The people who were dumping on him and throwing shoes at him and so on, probably in many cases their family members had been tortured. So that was absolutely direct. I think it's a big difference. If we want to talk about statues, I would love to see one day where China brings down its statues of Chairman Mao, arguably the biggest killer of the 20th century. But would be impossible in China. So I do think that countries need to be honest about their past. But I'm just not sure this is the right way to go about it.